Thanks for being here at the last session, at the last day of the conference. I'm excited to talk to you about shelter data. How many of you in the room have done a public records request? Awesome, cool. So I am obsessed with this. I stay up until 3 a.m. looking at shelter data. I've pulled about 40 public information requests over the last 6 months, and I'm still going. So I'm hoping to share some useful information on how to get this information, how to read it, and how to use it in your community. My journey to data, I actually, in my high school, was famous for jumping out of my math window in Algebra 2 in 11th grade and not getting caught. I did that pretty regularly to avoid math class. So I've not always been a math person. It wasn't until I started at Maddie's Fund a couple of years ago. I was the dog program coordinator there, and we were hoping to gather some research about foster programs and how to make them more useful. I had become really, really geeked out about all of the resources that were on the Maddie's Fund website, and I had stumbled across Dr. Jefferson's talk about saving the bottom 50%. And so my mentor at the time, Dr. Darpino, and I were like, let's do the same thing here. So I started going around to shelters and asking them who's still dying. Who's still dying in your shelter? Asking shelter directors, managers, and staff, and I couldn't get a clear answer to this question. How many of you have had this experience? You've asked shelters who's still dying, and you can't get an answer. People don't know. Yeah, it's a huge problem. So this is a dog, Biscuit. Biscuit was in the back of the shelter. I didn't know what that meant either at the time. Learned that there was a part of the shelter you couldn't go unless you were special. I met Biscuit and I found him a foster. And I went to go get Biscuit out of the shelter to have him meet his foster, and he had been killed. And I thought, this is incredible. A dog that looks like this, 20 pounds, is being killed in the shelter for aggression. So I knew something was wrong, and I didn't know what to do. I felt really, I didn't know what to do. So I started trying to find this information. I was like, there's gotta be data somewhere. Someone has to have this information. This is another dog, Rue. This is me with my dog, Rue. Another example of a dog who was in the back of the shelter in this part of California, Alameda County, labeled fractious, this 2-pound dog. She was blind, diabetic, and wasn't going to get out, and I knew something was wrong. So I started trying to look for this information, and again, I couldn't find it anywhere. So why am I so obsessed with these numbers? I'm obsessed with these numbers because they're attached to lives. When I'm looking at these numbers, I know on the other side of all of these numbers that we're counting as deaths and counting as live outcomes, these are animal lives. The more I look at data, the more attached I get to these numbers, and I've become just more and more obsessed, as I was saying. So I'm hoping by the end of this session, you'll be able to go home and do some detective work yourself and be able to find this information and use it. And all of the pets that you see in these photos were taken from Pima County through a group that I founded, a Pets Alive group, based on the model of knowing which animals are dying and then getting them out of the shelter. So that's a little cat Fig. So data saves lives. We've been talking about this throughout the weekend. In order to know which animals we still have to save, we have to know which animals are still at risk in our communities. And in order to know which animals are still at risk in our communities, we have to look at the numbers ourselves. We can't trust what we see on paper. We have to be looking at these numbers ourselves. So information is power, data saves lives. The goals of this presentation are to help you know which animals are still dying in your community, how to ask for help for these animals, and we're gonna start closing the gaps on these groups of animals. This is a dog, Nemo, who Dr. Wilcox, I'm sure you remember. This is an example of a plea that we put out for this dog, saying that we still needed hospice placement for this dog. He was bounced around from home to home, but we did get him into a home. And he lived his life out in a home. So if I'm successful, you'll be able to go home and do a records request tomorrow and find what's going on in your community. So why do you need to know the numbers? How many of you are advocates in the room? Okay, awesome. So as advocates, you might think that it's part of the shelter's job, the staff, managers, and directors at the animal shelters, to be giving you this information. Directors and managers often do not know their data. They will tell you something and it might not be right. It might not be what's actually happening in the shelter. The data reported publicly might not include all of the animals, or it might be skewed in some way. This could be on purpose, it could not be on purpose. It doesn't really matter. We still need to know these numbers. It's our job as animal advocates to educate directors on what's going on in their shelters and tell managers and tell directors what is happening and what we're seeing and what we're noticing looking at numbers. This is so, so powerful and so important. So by the end of this presentation, I hope that you will all be able to answer these questions. So what data do you need? This is going to differ based on what you're trying to look for, but we're going to run through a couple of data sets that you'll need to, in order to look at some things in your community. So there's two kinds of data that we're going to look at. It's big picture data and animal by animal. And that cat's so cute. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different case studies. This one is around big picture data. I pulled some big picture data, and this was all with a motivated shelter director who wanted to know the information that we found. So big picture data shows data over a period of time. This is really good for fact checking. If your shelter is telling you that they're saving 90% of the animals and you don't think that that's true, this is what you're going to use to find that number. Big picture data. This is great for live release rate for a month, 6 months, a year. You can use it to identify trends. So for example, an increase of deaths in the summer. Or that's a good example, I think. So at this particular shelter, advocates believe that cats were dying more often than dogs. Advocate groups in the community, I would hear this all the time. Cats are dying more than dogs. We need to put more energy into saving cats. What we found, what the data showed us, is that dogs were dying 3 to 1 to cats. So by identifying that information, we knew that we needed to be putting some more focus into getting dogs out of the shelter alive. 3 to 1. So this is animal by animal. And animal by animal, we suggest pulling a week in January and a week in June and using this information. If you want to dig deeper, or if when you're looking at the big picture data, you notice that there's a spike somewhere in deaths or live outcomes, I would recommend using that week also, like looking at that week. But by pulling a week in January and a week in June, that's a really good starting place. So this is the closest that we'll get to walking the kennels every day, is looking at animal by animal. You're going to find things like specific management issues. Is one vet killing more animals than another vet? Are you killing more animals on super busy days? You're going to be able to look at the details of trends and create targeted programs based on which groups of animals are dying. So if you're seeing that every single animal that's coming into the shelter with distemper is not leaving alive, you're going to be able to use this information and say, okay, we need to figure out how to target this group of distemper dogs. And again, specific management issues. So if there happens to be a vet that's killing more animals or on busy days. So when we pulled animal by animal data for this shelter, people believed that behavior was the #1 reason that dogs were dying in the shelter. What we found is that 66% of the dogs dying were due to medical conditions. And this is a dog, Miles, who was in the shelter for over 5 months with distemper and was taken by a foster and adopted by his foster. And he's such a couch potato. He was kind of a nut in the shelter, and now this is what he does all day. Very happy to see. So what do I mean when I say raw data? Does anybody want to answer that? What does raw data mean?
Maybe like export from database.
Okay. Yeah.
Every underlying record and
Okay. Okay, yeah. When I'm talking about raw data, for the purposes of this, I mean noses in, noses out. I mean every single animal that enters into the shelter or into custody of a rescue or an organization is counted regardless of what their outcome was. So when I'm talking about data, I'm always talking about raw data, never backing animals out. That's another little dog that Dr. Wilcox treated. So calculating live release rate. There's been a couple of different ways to calculate this over the years. When I talk about calculating live release rate, we're talking about live outcomes divided by total outcomes. And again, this includes everything. Every animal that has an outcome is included in total outcomes. So here's an example of how to do this calculation. This is at Stars Hollow Animal Shelter, Lorelei Gilmore and Rory. So the live outcomes are 15,000. Total outcomes are 20,000. So what's the live release rate for this? If live release rate is live outcomes over total outcomes, does anyone have any idea? 75%. So looking at this data, this is an example of some data. Looking at this data, we have adopted, owner redemption, working cat, transferred to rescue, community cat. Can we calculate live release rate using this information? People are nodding yes, yes. Yes, we can. This is a really good example of if you want to be publicly posting your data. This is Pima Animal Care Center. This is how they post their data. And we would encourage people to even break it down even more into puppies and kittens. So this is really important. There are some existing reporting mechanisms in the world. And all of the ways that data is being reported in your community, you're still maybe not going to get all of the information that you need. This is an example of Asilomar Accords. They back out owner-requested euthanasia. What's sort of useful about Asilomar Accords is that you can put that number back in if this is how your community is reporting. So you can still get the live release rate by putting that number back in. But what they're publicly reporting is not going to reflect the raw data number, but you can still get there. There's also Shelter Animals Count. Shelter Animals Count is an amazing tool. I would recommend that you all sign up for it, but it's a little bit different from what we're talking about today. And you're not supposed to use it for public reporting, so if you wanted to do a press release, you're not supposed to use the information that you find in shelter animals count in a press release. So you still want to do that public information request so that you have this information coming from a place where you can use it publicly. So shelter animals count, sign up for it, use it, it's awesome. Asilomar Accords purposefully backs out owner-requested euthanasia. If your shelter is using this, I would strongly encourage you to talk to your shelter director about switching to a system that's not going to back these animals out. And people also say annual reports. My numbers are on annual reports. Those numbers are great, and maybe they are accurate. Maybe your community is totally transparent. I would double check them anyway if you're trying to use this information for life-saving. So what happens to the live release rate when animals are hidden? So we're going to go back to Stars Hollow Animal Shelter. Live outcomes are 15,000, total outcomes are 17,000, and we're going to back out 3,000 animals that came in for ORE. That's a really high number. If you see that, you should definitely look into what's going on there. But so 3,000 animals are backed out in ORE. So what does it look like they're saving? It looks like they're saving 88%, but it's not including these other animal outcomes. So the raw save rate is still the same here, 75%, if you put those animals back in, right? So what about owner-requested euthanasia? This is a dog, Nelson, who came to PAC, Pima Animal Care Center, as an owner request and got out, and he got to live the rest of his life in a home and came to my house for a little bit. So what about owner-requested euthanasia? These animals should be treated like every other animal. If they come into your shelter, they leave your shelter somehow, and you should be honest with the public about how they're leaving. We're encouraging people to think about changing the way that we intake these animals, and don't even think about owner request as an intake type. That's a different conversation, but for the purposes of this, owner requests should be put into the numbers of the animal lives that are exiting your shelter, whether they leave alive or dead. So case study 3 is about owner-requested euthanasia. So at this shelter, leadership believed that it was enough to tell your staff to treat ORE like every other animal. If you do this, they will. All of these pictures are pictures of animals that were brought in as owner requests and left alive. What data showed us is that ORE, this category of owner-requested euthanasia, even with a shelter director telling people to treat these animals like every other animal, 75% of them did not have notes in their records before being killed, which means that they did not receive an exam like other animals should have, like other animals would have. And it means that they had no notes attached to their files at all. The shelter was believing the public 75% of the time that these animals should die. We should at least be looking at these animals enough that they have notes attached to their files. So why is it a problem to back out owner-requested euthanasia? The public, advocates, and potential lifesavers never even know about these animals if you do that. They don't know that these animals are even in your shelter enough to give them a chance at life, to tell their stories, to take them home. It also incentivizes shelters to force people to sign pets over for euthanasia. A story just came out in Baltimore that you can look up on the internet that this was happening. The shelter was encouraging people to sign their animals over as ORE when they were bringing them into the shelter for them to die. So this is a lot of information. So for big picture data, if you're gonna do a public information request, this is the information that you want to ask for. All intake, broken up by intake type, all live outcomes, including these categories, all other outcomes, including died in care, euthanized, stolen, missing, and ORE. So how do you get the data? You could ask to have a meeting or email the shelter or ask your friend who works there or your coworker, do you know who's dying in the shelter? You could do all of these things. But thanks to Congressman John Moss, we have the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. In a democratic society, the people have a basic right to the information about their government. Every municipal and municipal contracted organization in the United States under the Freedom of Information Act is legally obligated to give this information to the public, regardless of if you live in that state or not, or if you're an attorney or if you're just regular old me. So this was passed in 1966. And we'll see it referred to a lot of different ways. FOIA requests, public information requests, public records requests. We're always talking about the same thing. It's the same information. So the rules of animal shelter public records requests. This is sort of like my lesson. So know what question you want to answer before you put your request out. Only ask for what you need. You don't want to get like a ton of information back. You're just like drowning in data. Expect to hear nothing. I've put these records requests in and heard nothing, and I pick up the phone and I bug people until they give me this information. You have to be persistent, and you also have to be prepared to get misinformation or incomplete information. And you have to just ask them again. And I know that this sounds complicated, and it sort of is, but you'll get better at it, and I'm happy to help you also. So through doing this, I've found a bunch of really useful places to find different information that you need. So every state has a FOIA law. This website is a place where you can find your state's FOIA law. And that's just an example of one. And you're going to want this information so that you can use it in your public information request. So how long does it take? This is a website that tells you how long it can take. Muckrock, these people are obsessed with FOIA, and they have tons of information, but they also have information about how long it takes in your state. So it can be as little as 3 days, but also some states just say in a timely manner. That apparently is written into the law. Every time that I write one, I look at how long it takes in the state, and then I put it into a Google Sheet so that I know in 5 days I'm supposed to get this response. And if I don't hear back, I pick up the phone and bug people. Where do you send it? I use Google for this. That's the best way that I've found where to send these things. So I just put, where do I send a public information request for wherever I'm looking? And Google does that for me. And it does sometimes cost money. These are for the same requests, $600, and then someone wanted me to send them a money order for 70 cents, which I didn't do. I called them and said, really? And then they sent me the information anyway. You can always revise your request. You can always, when I got this $600 request, I called them. I said, how can I get this down? This is what I'm really looking for. They're really willing to work with you, the people in these offices. They really want to work with people to get them this information. These people are not attached to the animal shelters at all. They're working in offices where they're trying to get people information. And they've been really pretty wonderful to me. So this is a lot of information too, and I'll share this with anybody that they want, anyone who wants it. This is my template that I use to write a records request, but I don't sign it Jerry Seinfeld. I sign it with my name. But so at the top, and this is like Nathan Winograd has this all on his website, No Kill Advocacy Center. Also, I've adapted this a little bit, but. The law at the top, the law again, City of Costanza Animal Control, what I'm looking for, how much I'm willing to spend, and then if they don't have the information, please get back to me. And I'll share this with anybody who wants it, and I'm happy to, you can use this however you want. I'll put it online. This is just sort of reiterating that the law in the state, the name of the shelter you're trying to get information, in the most specific language possible what you want. It's important to be specific. If you want broken up by cat and dog, you need to say, cat, for cats, I want this. For dogs, I want this. If you want month by month, you need to say month by month. If you want day by day, day by day. So how do you read the data? You've sent the request, you got it back. It always feels like Christmas for me when I get these things back. So you open it up. It's gonna look really confusing at first, very confusing. It's gonna look like this maybe. You're like, what is this? I don't know what this is. Why is this all black and gray? I don't know. So it's really good to have something, and we just put this up on the American Pets Alive website. This is a data matrix that you can use. So when you get this, you can put it into here. So here we have release to other agency, release to rescue groups. You're going to take this information and you're going to put it in here. It's going to be a lot easier for you to read it and read through it. And this is what if you do animal by animal, it's going to look something like this. It's even more confusing. We just put this up on the website too. This is our youth analysis. Plug all of this information into here. So these are things you can get on the American Pets Alive website, these matrices. So, common discrepancies. Again, Nathan points to a lot of these, and I sort of learned from him what to look for and have adjusted this list a little bit. So, when you get this data, some of it's still gonna have things that don't add up, and you wanna watch out for that. So these are just a few of those things. Combining dead on arrival and died in care. People are gonna combine these numbers. These numbers should not be combined. One of them is not an intake category, and one of them should be a death category. Died in care should be counted in your death numbers. So if these are combined, you can reach out to your shelter director and say, these need to be separated. I need to see these as separate categories. It's impossible to calculate live release rate when these numbers are put together. Even if it's 4 animals, that's 4 animals. Backtracking numbers after the fact, I see this all the time. Numbers shouldn't change. And if they do, you should know why, and you should ask why. Why were there 100 animals that died last month when I looked a month ago, and now there's 25? This doesn't make sense. Not counting owner-requested euthanasia. There's 2 ways that I look at this. So there's some organizations that advertise owner-requested euthanasia, and when I get the numbers, I don't see that number anywhere. That should be an indication to you to look a little bit more closely. Are they just counting these in their youth category, or are these just not in their data at all? So that's something that you should definitely look at. And also having people sign animals over as intake, as ORE. If you have questions about that, we can talk about that after this session. Again, every animal should be counted regardless of the reason for intake. Not counting died in care at all as a death. This happens. This is happening less and less, thankfully, but there are some shelters that aren't counting died in care at all, which has forced people to let animals die in cages and not count them. Again, every animal who dies should be counted. Double counting foster, so one animal has 2 outcomes. So an animal will leave as a live outcome for foster and leave again as an adoption. And there's a couple more that are a little bit more complicated, and if you want to know more about that, find me after. So how do we use data to influence change? Now that we have this information, what do we do with it? Make this information public. Go outside and tell people about it. When I started Tucson Pets Alive, that's the people that I started Tucson Pets Alive with. We had information about what was happening in our shelter. We took a dog with us, we put an adoption vest on them, we went to Starbucks, and we started stopping everybody on the street that we could to talk to them about the animals that were still dying in our shelter and telling them how they could help. We posted on Facebook and made this information as public as possible. Focus on the animals who are dying and help them. So this is what we talk about at AMPA all the time. Knowing which groups of animals are dying in your community and focusing on helping those animals. This is how APA was formed, and this is a huge takeaway that we hope that you all have learned through the shelter. If there's another group that's helping a group of animals and they're impacting that group of animals, do something else. Find the next group of animals that's dying and help those animals. But you need to know first, right? Like with the dogs, we thought cats were dying. We found out dogs were dying. So we started focusing on dogs with medical problems instead of focusing on cats. I mean, we still helped cats, but I hope that makes sense. Know what needs to change and change it. So if you find that a vet through the animal by animal data is killing more animals than another vet, talk to the shelter leadership. Start talking about that. Start telling people that, Dr. X is killing more animals than another animal. If you're finding that animals are dying on busier days, start talking about that. Where do volunteers need to go in the shelter to help on those busy days to make sure that animals are not dying because you're busy? And ask for help and tell stories. This is an example of, again, that dog Miles. He was in the shelter for 5 months, and we weren't advertising these dogs that were in this distemper ward at all. They were sitting back there for months and months and months, just like losing their minds. And we expect, people don't want to take a dog home that is still shedding the distemper virus. These dogs can go to homes. They're not a threat to your animals if your animals are vaccinated. They're not a threat to the public if you're responsible, and we explained how to be responsible. And we got so much engagement for this dog that we were able to get 2 other dogs out with this post. And it was just because we were telling people that this dog, Miles, has been here for 5 months. And we knew that distemper dogs really, if there were not enough kennels in the distemper ward, that's it for them. So it is an emergency. This is an emergency. So your challenge for when you go home is to file a public records request, and please tell me about what you find. This is my email address. If you have any questions at all about how to do this, or you want to do this in your own community, or you think you found something fishy and you want someone else to look at it, please send this information to me, and I will help you as much as I possibly can. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions, so if anyone has any questions about this, I'd love to answer them.